Hey, this is Ing Venning. Welcome to Conscious Mosaic on this very dark and dreary rainy day. Um, I am so sorry to say that I was not able to get friends together to discuss The Witch because schedules got crazy. So hopefully we will be able to do that in the future, though probably not before Halloween or Samhain. And I just wanted to also say I love doing this channel. I feel like the work here is meaningful. I do, intelligent arts analysis videos, but I'm not very good at making the videos look flashy in terms of visual elements. I don't really know much about video editing. I don't know much about creating animations and things. If anyone out there is good at doing that kind of thing and would like to team up with me to work on this channel, if we ever got to the point that we could monetize it, I'd be happy to split the funds with you just to be able to continue doing this channel and providing awesome intelligent arts analysis. So for today, I would like to discuss a film that's called Home Movie. It's from 2008. It is a very underrated, overlooked film, and I'm sorry to say that. I know that on the surface it looks like just another found footage horror film, but this film is doing exactly the kinds of things that found footage ought to be doing, and I really think it's a great movie. I really think it's worth the watch. I wrote a paper on it a couple of years ago, and I would like to read that paper to you today. It's called Strangers in My House, an analysis of role models in the film Home Alone from 2008. Should we be surprised? How often do we see tragedy on the news, shooting, stabbing, bombing, rape, torture, and wonder, how could that have happened? How often do we think this came out of nowhere, or who would have expected this? I have often witnessed such reactions myself, especially when children commit particularly cruel acts. People often feel hesitant to blame parents and sometimes go to unnecessary lengths to exonerate them. But in many cases, there were warning signs that these children might harm others, often signs of which parents were perfectly aware or which they even encouraged to manifest. We simply fail to notice them much of the time because our society has acclimated us to cruelty. I believe that Home Movie, a horror film from 2008, presents such a perspective to the viewer. The Poe family, Father David, Mother Claire, and children Jack and Emily, seem to have the kind of life the typical American dreams of: a lovely house, good educations, solid and respectable careers, and two children. But this facade hides a deeply disturbed household. Jack and Emily are unable to feel compassion. They perform acts of cruelty and violence that grow more and more socially unacceptable, culminating in the murders of their parents. What becomes apparent as we watch the film is that Jack and Emily aren't acting on their own. In scene after scene, their parents support and enable their violence. David and Claire Poe role model behaviors that mimic those of their children, presenting a picture of how disturbing typical American families really are. Trash bags, storybook dragons, and other direct lessons. Although he teaches a number of covert lessons, Father David Poe also provides his children with some disturbing lessons in a direct manner. His scouting lessons, for instance, include some of the very techniques, such as lockpicking and knot tying, that his children will later use to enter his bedroom and bind him. Moreover, David offers a lesson that Jack might well take as philosophical rather than practical during the scene in which Jack is raking leaves. David has already set an example wherein violence is trivialized. Jack is, after all, raking leaves because he threw a rock at his dad. However, because the rock didn't cause any lasting damage, Dad decides to give Jack a light punishment and make a joke of it. This is surely a bad precedent for a boy whose thoughts are so full of violence. David, however, compounds his error in giving Jack the advice that dead things go in trash bags. This argument, of course, implies that a person can kill someone as a means of rendering them unwanted and disposable. It is therefore not surprising that late in the film, Jack and his sister Emily should place their human victims into trash bags. Another of Dad's overt lessons actually teaches an unintended message. This is conveyed as David reads The Dragon and the Paper Bag. It's entirely possible, given his personality, that David only reads this story because it seems a fun thing to do at the time. But when asked by Claire, he indicates that the moral of the story is that one should beware of strangers, an exchange that provides some foreshadowing of Claire's later scene in the potting shed. But David cannot really believe this, for he undermines this very lesson when he not only talks to a stranger, an ice cream man whose incongruous location may indicate that he's dealing drugs or hiding other secrets, but actually takes food from said stranger and gives it to his children. We can imagine that Jack and Emily are absorbing quite a different lesson as the tale is read, the lesson that they can victimize others by appearing to be normal children. In fact, they employ the lesson to nearly fatal effect when they allegedly befriend Christian McNamara in order to murder him. The dragon in the story wears a human mask in order to fool his victims, just as Jack and Emily wear the visages of polite children for the same reason. They are truly themselves, however, when they are wearing their dragon masks, sheltering behind their dragon curtain, and enacting hideous deeds like the dragon in the story. They appear to adopt these guises not only in order to mask their real feelings, but also in order to distance themselves from their victims. When David and Claire become two of those victims, we are shown the true moral of the tale of the dragon. You can fool your victims by acting like them, even though you are truly a stranger. Aren't David and Claire, after all, behaving like undisciplined children in order to make their children act more like the adults they cannot truly be? In such a family, all identities are displaced in some way, and everyone is a stranger, even to him or herself. Faith in common, the root of many indirect lessons. The sinister implications of Jack and Emily's overt lessons are reinforced by the lessons that their parents instill without really thinking about what they're doing. Through the lens of the camera, we are both observing what David and Claire mean to teach and much of what they don't mean to teach. When taken alongside the overt lessons, the unintended and often hidden lessons send a very disturbing message to the two children. Why are David and Claire teaching such inappropriate lessons? Their parenting is derived, as is likely the case with most parents and guardians, from their philosophies about life in general. The movie presents a very clear message, however, that David and Claire haven't thought very consistently and rationally about how to parent, despite their having been exposed to some very definite ideas about children and their development in their various occupations. The scene in which David and Claire tell about their initial romance, and therefore the beginning of the feelings that led to the birth of their children, shows us the cognitive dissonance that exists between their ideas and their actions. The couple admit that their common ground is found in faith, each in his or her own particular career and its tenets, as well as each in the dubious love of the other. But that faith, and therefore the philosophies taken therefrom, is confused. Faith, while it can be a positive quality, should never be trusted as a parenting tool in lieu of rational understanding. And perhaps that's why this whole scene seems so incongruous. David, while dressed as a pagan archetype, the Easter Bunny, appears to believe in a Christian God. Claire, who seems to believe in Freud, chomps on a carrot even as she makes lewd allusions. In fact, we see something closer to David and Claire's shared theology early in the film, when the couple decide to play ghost hunter on Halloween. And the message they're sending, that it's fun to be afraid and frighten others, certainly isn't forgotten by the film's end. Clearly, like most American parents, the elder Poes have never properly thought about how to educate their children. They are parenting based only on confused faith, and that faith fails them miserably. This joint irresponsibility, though caused by blind faith, manifests in different ways for each parent. David, for instance, tends toward a parenting style that is jocular, but often verbally, psychologically, and physically abusive, perhaps even sexually abusive. He is self-abusive at times. For instance, he repeatedly tells himself, "You suck," while working on a sermon. He can't believe that anyone would want to hear this shit, his message, on Christmas. We also observe him slapping himself a couple of times. But his abuse isn't limited to himself. Although we do not actually behold any biting in the film, we know that David is, at the very least, a silent witness to the fact that his children are abusing each other. And we witness him binding his children to a bed and trying to force demons out of them, which serves as a direct sign of his abusive tendencies. We also get a glimpse of his abuse of others during the Thanksgiving dinner scene. When Jack and Emily protest the prayer, Dad becomes angrier and angrier. Finally, out of patience, he slams his fist on the table just as the camera is turned off. We can only imagine what happens afterwards, but it should come as no surprise that Jack and Emily later bind their parents and film them at a table with food on it. Though the children are behaving in a cruel manner, they must be expressing what it felt like for them to be trapped by their father's anger on that Thanksgiving day, and most likely on a number of other occasions. When David tries to explain his philosophies to his children, as has already been attested during the raking and scouting scenes, he appears confused at best. He tells Emily, for instance, about demons and angels, explaining to her that a bad thing happens for every good thing. If we invert this statement, as Emily likely does, we come to the conclusion that doing bad is justified because a good thing will happen for each bad one. If David's approach to parenting takes an overly passionate, authoritarian tone, Claire's fails on the conformist, negligent end of the continuum of parenting styles. Claire enables David's abuse with her silence and complicity. Moreover, fixing the problems that children face doesn't take much effort in her reasoning. It doesn't require talking out problems or behaving as a good role model. Instead, as Claire declares at one point in the film, there is only treatment and diagnosis. I have treated my children. Unfortunately, Jack and Emily are disturbed human beings, not a disease. Ultimately, Claire's medicines are unable to control them. Parental drugs of choice, more indirect lessons. David and Claire cannot parent effectively, and their use of drugs only exacerbates the problem. David uses one specific drug, alcohol, to try to control himself. But the alcohol makes a poor substitute for self-discipline, and not surprisingly, David's control often slips. Claire, on the other hand, primarily uses drugs to control others, in particular her patients, which come to include Jack and Emily. Indeed, Claire manifests much of her power as a cold and negligent parent when she begins Jack and Emily on their course of drugs. So far as the movie presents their lives, Jack and Emily don't receive any counseling. They aren't treated as people, but rather as subjects whose behaviors can be switched on and off. Claire likely plants one of the seeds of her later captivity when she warns her children that their prescriptions must be monitored so they don't slip into conscious comas. Again, the children's actions in the final minutes of home movie shouldn't surprise us. Just as their mother has drugged them to make them obedient, Jack and Emily now seize control by using those very drugs on her and their father. Once more, the final scenes reveal that Jack and Emily are simply acting on what they've been taught, that their behavior is not so much a mystery as it might have initially appear. Indirect lessons on the lack of sanctity of life. Jack and Emily, like many children with violent personality disorders, don't seem to acknowledge that life is at all sacred or to be treated with respect. But these attitudes can't be a product of their psychology alone, for Home Alone shows us that David and Claire are themselves unconcerned with most, if not all, life outside that of themselves, and for most of the movie, their immediate blood relations. Jack and Emily commit a number of acts of cruelty toward animals, as one might expect in children with severe personality issues. Their mother and father don't react appropriately to these acts. For instance, when Jack makes a sandwich out of the family's pet fish, he obviously faces little or no consequence for his actions. In the next scene, we find Claire preparing for Thanksgiving dinner while joking with David, and David and Claire are only reacting to and carrying out the traditions of their society. Fish sandwiches are common in America, and a great many families buy and prepare dead turkeys for Thanksgiving. Furthermore, there is no recognition that anything of value has been lost as David quips about turkey proctologists without regard to the life that once inhabited the carcass on his table. Very early in the film, we discover Claire holding the family cat in front of Jack and Emily's birthday cake. She holds it rigidly, even when it becomes frightened, hissing, and trying to get away. It seems to be part of the family fun on the holiday that is both Halloween and the birthday of the twins. This moment, which would probably strike very few Americans as sinister, presages at least two acts of animal cruelty which will later be committed. Several scenes later, we discover that Emily has placed Nikolai the frog into a vice grips to kill it. The machine she chooses to inflict Nikolai's death is one built for the purpose of holding things still so that they might be of use or interest to the user, and echoes the rigidity with which the cat was held. Later still, we find that Jack and Emily have crucified this very animal. And again, crucifixion is a way of holding something rigidly in place, just as they observe their mother hold the cat. Jack and Emily do not seem to hold with their parents' confusing manner of arbitrarily deciding which animals are to be protected and which are to be murdered. Furthermore, and not surprisingly, David and Claire do little more than demonstrate shock at the children's actions and make them take a few tests. David and Claire fail to recognize the seriousness of Jack and Emily's actions, thus leaving Christian McNamara and themselves open to danger. Claire's lack of respect for human beings has already been demonstrated by her generally cold temperament and treatment of people, especially children, as objects to be studied. But David extends his lack of compassion for animals into the world of humanity in a different way, with his humor. In particular, we find that much of David's humor takes on a prejudicial tone. He speaks as a caricature of a Chinese person when he is narrating Jack's raking, scolds the dog in an allegedly hilarious French voice, and jokingly refers to Nikolai as a commie bastard. We also discover that he was a shameless flirt and part of the Greek social system, a system frequently responsible for rape, when he was in college. These attitudes exemplify the notion that certain groups of people can be readily trivialized, mocked, even tortured or killed, without causing David any concern. Lessons indirect and meta-cinematographic. Yes, try saying that 5 times fast. Home movie is quite accurately named, as is evidenced by the use of meta-cinematography throughout the film. This motif is primarily depicted through David's use of the camera. In his hands, the camera becomes a way to humiliate and anger his family. He teases Jack and Emily about having to wear their pilgrim costumes on Thanksgiving. He coerces Claire into speaking her New Year's resolution into the camera, and often uses it to invade her privacy in other ways, such as during the shower scene. And the camera should make the astute viewer aware of those moments that slip through the cracks. The movie is presented to us through the camera, but the use of the device also reminds us of the periods when it is turned off. We get a hint of what might be happening during those times when Dad slams his fist into the table at Thanksgiving, or when Claire also catches the children being bitten. But the camera implies, as David himself reinforces, that secrets are essential. It will probably strike us as obvious at this point that the lessons of the camera are integrated into Jack and Emily's schemes. Indeed, the two children proudly announce the Jack and Emily show. Just as they were their father's victims when David held the camera, we are now Jack and Emily's victims. Jack says he knows we're in there, indicating the camera, and then brazenly dares us to watch the entire movie. Just as Jack and Emily finally find their voices near the end of the movie, for the sake of deception, they discover the use of the camera for their pleasure. Jack and Emily have been effaced for much of, if not all of, their lives by their passionate father and dispassionate mother. The camera helps them end their effacement by documenting their rise to power within the Poe household and, by implication, of addressing the viewers, the world at large. Strangers in my house. Halfway through the film, Claire huddles in a cold, disused potting shed, itself a sign of failed fertility, and confesses her New Year's resolution to the camera. She wants her family to be what she thought they ought to be in the past, even though she doesn't seem to recall what that was. She laments, "There are strangers in my house." The fact that she is talking to David through the camera supplies proof thereof, but we should also notice that she's addressing a picture that includes a depiction of herself with these words. Jack and Emily, I would contend, weren't always violent. I believe their behavior has been learned through the direct and indirect lessons that their parents have taught them over the course of their lives, and that process seems to be a multi-generational one. We know little of David's childhood and less of Claire's, but we do know that David was abused, perhaps just as he abuses his own children and other creatures, and that he got to carry the saw as a child, learned during the Christmas tree scene, one in which the family is using said saw to end a tree's life for their holiday entertainment. But this is enough for us to suspect that David and Claire have inherited parenting styles both abusive and enabling of abuse. David and Claire were almost certainly made to feel disrespected and powerless as children, as is common for young people in America, and they've passed on the attitudes they've inherited. They are merely sharing a set of disturbing traditions and trends that ultimately fail their children utterly. And we notice this almost at the beginning of the film in the choice of David's and Claire's costumes. They dress as a created monster and his wife, Frankenstein and his bride, on Halloween / their children's birthdays. By the end of the film, Claire readily displays scorn for the offspring she has raised and tells them, "You are not my children." If Claire is concerned about strangers in her house, she must first address that there is a stranger in her own body. Somewhere in her life, and probably her childhood, she lost her sense of what is kind and sacred. She role models that change for her offspring. She and her husband reflect the larger American culture, one in which life is cheap and murder is common. Jack and Emily may be monstrously cruel, but they are only reenacting what they've been taught. The Poe household, though it contains a family of strangers, approximates the warped ideal of American normalcy. So that was my analysis of Home Movie. Please watch the movie if you haven't already and let me know what you think. Do you agree? Do you disagree? And I will be back hopefully maybe later this week or next week, either with Geeky Friends Discuss or one of my own discussions of something else. So everybody, I hope you enjoyed this one. Have a fantastic Halloween and Samhain, and I'll see you soon.